So welcome Kijo, welcome everybody that is joining us. You have stepped into a powerful conversation today. My name is Ananda Leeke. I'm a thriving mindful coach, an author, an artist, a human design doula, and a interfaith reverend. And today I'm talking with my dear soul sister love, Laura Pusey, who is a grief therapist based in the UK. And we're talking about loving yourself as you live, and I'm pausing, in grief during a global pandemic. And I'm going to say that again, loving yourself as you live in grief during a global pandemic, because guess what? We're still in it. Whether you are accepting the third dimension or the fifth dimension, we have to move our bodies and breathe in a global pandemic. So how are you, Laura?
I'm fine. All is well. I'm happy to be here again for part 2 of this session. Happy, content.
All right. We're happy that you are happy. So I want to just first start with, because some folks who may be watching this may not remember the conversation we had yesterday. They may not have been a part of it, and those on replay may only see this. Can you tell folks who you are and why you're called to do this work?
Okay. All right. So I am Laura D Pusey. I'm the founder of Dipism and FACFO. I am a death practitioner, which means that I am there through every aspect of dying, death, and grief. I work within those aspects as an end-of-life guide. That's somebody who can be there to help you to get your life together as you face your final transition with yourself and your family members present. I'm also a funeral celebrant, so I conduct funerals and create services for people who are at the end of life. So they may also be celebrations of life before the transition has been made, or even memorials following the actual transition. And I am a transformational grief practitioner, therapist. And through that, I help people to work through their grief, to overstand their grief, and come to a forward movement with the energy of that grief. In doing so, I've created 2 books, My Life's Tapestry and Tapestries of Grief. Both are part of a program, let's say, to help us to open up to the often taboo subjects of dying, death, and grief. You know, yesterday, Ananda, I was saying that book, that My Life's Tapestry you've got there is going to be worth something. I do believe you're the only person in the world who's got that cover. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Yeah. I think one of them just fell on the floor. I'm going to get it. So tell people what grief is as an energy and as a normal process.
Okay, so as an energy, grief is the emotion that is worked through following a loss, not necessarily following a death transition. You could be, grieving a relationship, grieving a friendship, grieving the loss of a material item or a way of life. There are so many things that we grieve throughout our lives, and we are focusing at this time on the grief that follows a death transition. Grief is an emotion. It sits in the body, and it is a necessary energy that comes to us when healing is necessary. It is the reaction to an event or a situation, and it's our body's way of communicating and letting us know where we are on that journey. I can't remember what the second part of the question was.
You touched on both the natural process and that it's an energy. And I also want folks to understand what you mean by overstand, because those are some of your phrases. I call them Laurisms or dipisms.
Thank you. Yes, to overstand. So that is stolen from the language of Patois and Rastafari. So to understand is to stand under somebody else's authority. It's to follow the directive, the narrative that has been set. So many of us understand and we accept what we are told. To overstand is to master. To overstand is to have full awareness of ourselves, our bodies, and our grief journey, instead of having it dictated to us. Oh, they've been gone 2 weeks and you're still crying. 2 months, and, you're still in bed. To overstand grief is to manage your own grief, to recognize that whatever stage you're at, it's fine, it's okay. And that every emotion that comes up through that time of grief, that mourning period, is natural and necessary. Yesterday we spoke about bitterness. Bitterness is an emotion. It's a natural emotion. And there are so many natural emotions that we have been taught to stay away from or not to express because they're ugly, because they upset others, they make others feel uncomfortable. And we want to look happy all the time and display this happy exterior all the time. But it's not always as easy as that. I'm fine. Yes, I'm fine. Absolutely not. Inside, I am not fine. Inside, my emotions are all over the place and I'm struggling. But how often are we able to actually say that? When you can overstand your grief, you can say it without apology. This is where I am. This is who I am. Recognizing that the transition of grief is moving yourself, your life, your existence from one state to another. And this is about you getting to know the new you. So you overstand. I encourage overstanding as opposed to understanding.
I love that. And I love that. And yesterday on part 1, and you can watch the replay video, and I want to welcome Marilyn, MJ Fontaine, Valerie Trammell, Althea, and others that have joined us since we started. This is part 2 of a conversation that we started yesterday in our grief and self-love series. And this really is necessary, whether we like it or not. And yesterday, both Laura and I talked about our own journey of grief. And I want Laura to just tell us briefly about what caused you to wake up and recognize that grief was something that you needed to embrace, and which later became your life's work.
Yeah. But I would start by saying that although I had grown up around death, and that was no stranger to me, I didn't actually know grief until my father passed away in 2004. For some reason, I had said 2009 yesterday, 2004. Before then, death was just death. It's just something that happens. Then it was grief. I feel like I want to be dead. I don't want to be here anymore. I'm feeling these emotions that are so strong and powerful and disabling. As I went through this journey, I came to realize that this is a natural experience that needs to be had and needs to be worked through. It wasn't an overnight realization. Since my father died, I've experienced many other transitions. My mother's passing was extremely, what's the word I'm looking for? Instrumental in my coming to terms with the fact that grief is a thing that needs to be spoken of, and that awareness needs to be brought to this table, because not all of our relationships are happy and jolly.
Yeah.
The relationship that I'd had with my mother was such that I realized that I had actually grieved her long before she passed away. So what is this thing called grief? Why do I feel like this? Why am I crying? You know, how do I deal with this? And how does this impact the rest of my life and the decisions that I make moving forward? I qualified as a clinical hypnotherapist, and I realized that through hypnosis, through trance work, I could actually locate grief and help people to transmute it into something that they could actually work with, come to terms with, befriend in a way, overstand and recognize, and then nip in the bud quicker and quicker and quicker, as opposed to staying in that period of mourning and grief for prolonged times, which in itself can create situations as well. So, yeah, my journey has been one that I have personally felt. And how dare I let that go to waste and not share it with anybody else?
Well,
so the books that I've written are the books that I could have done with at that time. Yep.
tell them the titles so they know what is.
So this is Tapestries of Grief. Tapestries of Grief is the one that we're talking about, and My Life's Tapestry, which is an end-of-life guide, which takes us through the whole journey, the whole life adventure.
And I'm using both of these books to navigate the losses that I've experienced in terms of the people that have passed. If you follow me on Instagram, you know that I've lost one of my very dear soul sister loves, Lauren Medlock Smith, one of my law school classmates, and her anniversary of her death is in a couple weeks. And it wasn't until I started exploring Laura's books and learned about the 17 different types of grief, and that grief is an energy and that grief is a natural process, that I really started to say, well, I need to carve out some time to deal with both the loss of loved ones and the loss of the life that I had before the pandemic began. Because yesterday, Laura walked me through an exercise that really had me open up to experiencing grief in a different way. And it was a way of, not that I have to deal with this, or it was a softer way. And in that opening, things started to happen today for me. And I started moving some things around in my home and started to declutter some things that I've left kind of pile up in a way. And in stirring the stuff up, you know, when you start to clean, you get dust and residue. Some other things started to come up. And I was so grateful that we're having this conversation now, because I know I'm not the only one. I just want to give folks in the chat an opportunity to chime in as we move further into the discussion. Is anybody grieving anything? Are you grieving the loss of loved ones? You're grieving the loss of a pet? Your life that you had before the pandemic? What are you all grieving, if anything? And what is that? How is that impacting you? And go ahead and share in the chat. And as Laura and I move into the conversation, I'll make sure that I give you all shout outs. So in your work, you discuss 17 different types of grief. I was just amazed. Can you give us some of the most common types within those 17 so people get to a feel for what you're talking about. Because what we want them to do is to go to dipism.com and buy the books,
Yes.
to learn more.
Yeah. Okay. So, yes, I've listed 17. There may be many, many more. Mm-hmm. However, off the top of my bar, I've got the book here as well, but, there are so many. There's the anticipated. We often might find ourselves in a situation where we are with a loved one and we know that the passing is imminent. We anticipate the passing, but the grief is not something that we really think of, let's say, initially, until it hits. What we're thinking of, though, is the life that we should have had with our loved one, the life that our loved one should be going on to experience. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes we feel that our loved one isn't ready. So, yes, anticipatory grief, I might have actually got that confused with something else, but then there's also collective grief. So the main example that I can think of is when 9/11 happened. Mm-hmm. That was a collective grief that was experienced by the nation, by the world. The shockwaves rippled through the world, and they still ripple today. That there is collective grief, where we all feel on the same kind of level. It may affect us in different ways and at different times, but we all know where it's coming from. I've spoken about denied grief, when you are denied the right to be with your loved one or be a part of the family, when that right is taken away from you, when it is denied you, when you are unable to cry publicly for your loved one. And that might hit us in many different ways. I've got the experience, my own experience. I speak of my own experience at that point. I believe when my mother passed away, I was denied access to know, the details of her, where, the funeral directors, the details of her actual homegoing ceremony, let's say, the details of where she was going to be laid to rest, where her ashes would be. This has a knock-on effect. Denied grief. Others feel that they have the right to grieve, but you don't. This affects us. Let's see. Inhibited grief is when somebody locks those emotions away, when they feel that they are unable to discuss them. Oftentimes we refrain from letting our grief flow because we do not know what's on the other side. Yeah. For some of us, this is the story that keeps our back straight, that enables us to keep going. And sometimes if we actually bring ourselves to that stop, to actually think about what's happened and take in the magnitude of our loss, what comes next? Who are we once that story's been told, once we've done that work? So there are many different types. Secondary grief as well is one of my favorites because we don't acknowledge it. You lose somebody who is detrimental to your life, so important to your life, key, mandatory. Not only do they go, but there's also what they contribute, what they bring to the table. We have our loved ones in the physical, but then we may have their financial input. We may have their, their mental capacity. When we have problems, they would have been the one that we went to. Yeah. We may find that we are now homeless or that we have to work extra hours because not only have we lost our loved one, but we've lost the extra support that's been given all those years without us even realizing, because we're working in teams.
So I want to stop right here just for a second and chime in. Kijo says that the loss of loved ones and connecting with people, that has been an area where they've grieved. I want to welcome everybody that just joined us. Letty Gooch, Dari, Dare You Ask, Junius, welcome. Ms. Nye, Jin to Jim. So good to have everybody here. NK Beloved, Ezra, Reggie, It's MB. Thank you all for being here. So I want to ask, what would you call the loss of life, the normal way that we've lived prior to the pandemic? How would you categorize that type of grief? Because I know a lot of people may not realize it, but it will pop up if you haven't.
Yeah, so how would I... Okay, let's rephrase that question then. So
how would you, what kind of grief would you call the loss of our normal lives from before the pandemic?
Gosh, that's a question. Mm-hmm. I think that I would actually have to sit with that. Mm-hmm. And maybe define it. I don't think off the top of my head that I would be able to define it with any of the descriptions that I've got in the book. Because what we're talking about here is an ongoing kind of grief that, how do I put this?
It's ongoing grief. You could just call it.
Yeah, it's an ongoing grief, but everything remains the same. Okay, so we have experienced losses, but there are new ways now. There are new ways of interacting with people. With what's coming now through this pandemic is a huge division on many unspoken levels. And I'll give an example. I was in the company of a great many people very recently. And for example, some were wearing masks and some were not. Mm-hmm. And it really changed the interaction between the groups of people. Mm-hmm. This is, and now we're talking an inability to hug, to love the way we once did, the freedom to interact as we once did. Mm-hmm. This kind of grief may not necessarily be immediately recognized. It's an imposed coldness with people who still live, people who are still there, but that we cannot interact with as we once did. Mm-hmm. In truth, we can. Mm-hmm. In truth, we can continue as we are, but there is a fear, an ongoing fear attached to this type of grief. So what we'll have to do is to do another live, and I'll be able to answer that. Yeah.
All right.
I'll definitely give it some thought, because that's a really interesting question.
Mm-hmm. It definitely is, because it's something that I'm always thinking of in terms of mourning these losses, and my approach is to just be aware. I'm wanting to be aware in myself and in others, because I know in the past with my own grief, with the loss of loved ones, and even in the loss of a career, identity, you just, when you think that you're through it, something triggers you and you find yourself back at it. And that leads me to the grief wheel and the 7 stages. In Laura's books, she talks about this thing called a grief wheel, and she walks you through 7 stages. And I really want folks to kind of get an idea of this. So tell us about it. Of the grief wheel and the 7 stages.
Right, okay. So I'm just looking it up now so that I can show it to you all as we're here. But the stages are loosely taken from the stages of grief as outlined by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. The reason why I've adapted them, the whole thing, is because these models that we've been given never look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture includes the secondary losses. It includes the changes that we're discussing now. For example, when somebody we love passes away, we have to consider the family dynamics. We have to consider our status now. Am I still a mother? Am I still a wife? Am I now a widower? What does that mean? The financial situation as well. And also when somebody we love passes away, we may have to consider our spiritual belief system, which is also something that we may actually grieve over. All of these things impact upon our grief and how we handle grieving. So we start off with trauma, and that's the experience, that's the event, that's the thing that's triggered our grief. Even if we know that our loved one is passing away, the actual event is quite traumatic. When we are hit out of the blue, unexpectedly, this is a trauma. Our whole bodies carry this trauma within us, and it takes us a while for it to filter in. Yes, we get it on a conscious level, but on the subconscious, every cell in our body is aligned to that person. And so they're not being there, or under the circumstances through which they are no longer available to us in the physical, affect us. This is trauma. And then we go on to anguish. So again, this is very much, grief is very much a physical. It's a body thing, Our bodies, we feel anguish within. We feel it in our hearts. We feel it in our soul. And from anguish, we go on to this feeling of exasperation. I've got my book in front of me. I've got several.
That's fine. So people can see it. Yeah.
So this is the grief wheel. And what I'll do is I will also post it on my page, and I can also send it to you, Ananda, in its original form. But yeah, when you've got anguish, it's a pain that you're feeling. You're feeling this on a cellular level. And you may have feelings of guilt and regret also that need to be worked through. Again, oftentimes we are harder on ourselves than we actually need to be. There are not very many of us who will go out of our way to inflict pain and hurt on those we love. When somebody is facing a transition, or when somebody has made that transition, the chances are we have done everything that we could have done. But oftentimes we're left feeling that we didn't do enough. Yeah. Because if we had done enough, then they would still be here. But those transitions have to be made. And that can lead to us feeling quite exasperated. So with exasperation, you may find yourself feeling vexed, less patient with people, more snappish, like, come on, how many times do I have to tell you? Or, if he were here, I wouldn't have to do this, So these feelings of just frustration and, just exasperation of this new way of having to be, this adaptation of life that we now have to adjust to. And then we've got the haggling stage. And that's more of I suppose, on a spiritual level. you know, the if only I could get them back, what I would do to have them back, retracing our steps, if only I hadn't done this, and if I could have done this, could I get them back? And, you know, the experience is being had. The time came for them to make that transition. In our minds, we would do anything we can. You know, we may inherit money. I would give anything to just have my loved one back. I don't even want the money. It's not about them. I just want my loved one back. That is a stage that we all do go through. And it does bring about deep sorrow. Overall, grief is a deep sorrow that sits within us. And that is the energy. That's the energy. The energy is sorrow. And so it's about coming to terms with that sorrow and just being aware of the emotions that come up through that sorrow and allowing them to be. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be frustrated, bitter, angry, vexed. It's okay. It's necessary. Because not only is your mind trying to make sense of this, but your body is too. And these emotions are coming up so that you might deal with them, accept them, learn to love them, and not try to stifle them, because then that is where pain comes in. The stifling of our emotions, the stifling of our sorrow will cause it to sit in places within our bodies, often where we are at our weakest, and there it will ferment and then cause sickness and wear away at our bodies. It could be the liver, the kidneys, the heart, you know, and it could give rise to diseases such as, you know, diabetes or, you know, blood pressure even. We then trot off to the doctors thinking that we need to be medicated, when really what we needed to be doing was talking about our grief. And they may not manifest until years down the line, 10, 20 years even, that they come to the fore, and we're thinking, well, what's this about? You know, I've been living a pescatarian life for however many years. I've been exercising, you know, I've been doing the most. And now I'm hit with sickness. Oftentimes we don't even think back to the grievances and the traumas that we experienced back then. But just because we haven't remembered them, it doesn't mean that they're not sitting within our bodies, ticking away and waiting for that moment to just bang. And when that moment comes, it's often a new trauma that triggers it. Then we move on to readjust. We need to come to, or we find that we come to a point where we start to readjust. Bills still need to be paid. Children may need to be looked after. We may have to go back to work. We may have to find new employment. We may have to find a new place to live. We may have to. There's so many. It doesn't stop because life continues. So we readjust to a new life now without our loved one, without the support or the comfort that they would have given. We are now left with their memories, and we can use those memories to forward on our journey. And when somebody does pass away, we don't just leave them behind. We bring them with us. So it's about finding that way now that they will live with us, and that we will take them forward into our new lives, giving ourselves permission to laugh again, to love again, and to enjoy our lives in honor of our loved one. So yes, that's coming from the grief wheel. So it's them. And this is taken from the book Tapestries of Grief.
Thank you. Thank you for walking us through that. You know, one of the things that Laura talks about, and she keeps emphasizing in our conversation yesterday, today, and in her work, is that each stage, each part of this process, natural process of grieving, is to be taken in your own time. There's no expiration date on it. It's not like you can say, well, it's going to be a year too. I'm going to take 3 months or 30 days or 15 minutes. It doesn't work like that. It is a process that you have to surrender to. It's a process that is, in many ways, I feel like when grief shows up in my life, when loss shows up in my life, that's a red flag for me to practice self-love, to go deeper in self-love. Self-love in terms of loving kindness, compassion, non-judgment, patience, and forgiveness. It is critical that we, as we move through this global pandemic, because I know in myself, this grief, whatever we're going to call whatever Laura's going to call the global pandemic grief, because she's definitely going to come up with something, and we're going to come back and talk about it whenever she's ready.
Absolutely.
Whatever this is going to be called, whatever this big ticket grief is, it's laying on top of other stuff. And it's triggering. And it's year 3 we're walking into. And so my concern for humanity is that what happens 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30 years from now, and these layers keep building up. Let's begin to look at this shit now.
Yeah.
Let's begin to look at it now. You know, in bite-sized pieces. You ain't got to go in and like take a big shovel and just start digging and digging and digging. We're just saying, asking yourself to gently enter into an excavation process, an investigation process. Excavation may scare you. I like excavation because it makes me say, hey, I'm going deep. Because it's my natural inclination to go deep. But to investigate what you lost. What have you lost in living through a global pandemic? And just listing it, loved ones, being able to hug people, freedom of movement, employment, access to certain things that you would do, activities. What is it? Maybe you had to move. But looking at that and coming at it so that you are aware, because this stuff happens and it lives in your body. And I think, as Laura mentioned, she kept talking about the body. It's the body, and as a society, we are all up in here. We miss the heart, we miss the breath, and we miss the body, and we miss the spirit.
The body is under attack. It really is. And we seldom recognize that. And it's true what you've said, this new grief that I will define, we'll call it pandemic grief for now. It is so layered and it is so potent. And, you know, prior to the pandemic, if we had grief and time bombs ticking away within us, what we're going to see now is a rise in poor mental health. And that in turn will kick off a rise in, and has kicked off, a rise in people who have chosen to end their lives because the pain of the loss that we have experienced from 19 to now is immense on so many levels that are known and will never be known, but will come forward and will claim us if we allow, in our darkest times, which is why I'm such a big fan of talking. Talk without shame, talk without apology, share, because, you know, you can sit down and you can talk to somebody, and what a relief it is when they turn around and say, I understand. I've been feeling that way too. Mm-hmm. You know, have you thought of this? Mm-hmm. Maybe you can do that. There is more to life, you know. It's through that we help others to grow and to learn and to move through their experiences as well. So, yeah, I think that's a whole new book in itself.
Yeah, and I want to stop and say that we've got folks saying in the chat, but NG Beloved said, no hugging allowed anymore. And then people very tentative about hugging. And then Althea says, it's more robotic, appears to be the way forward. Personal touch is becoming a thing of the past, sadly. Being personal with people we love and trust is vital for humanity. And then, wait. Kijo says, I find myself more animated in conversation with people because I can't hug them or shake their hand. It's a difficult loss indeed, personal touch. And then Junia says, what is the name of the book? And I'm going to bring the books up again. So tell them what the name of the book is.
So this is Tapestries of Grief.
That's
Tapestries
one.
of Grief.
And then this one is...
This is My Life's Tapestry, which is an end-of-life guide, but it goes through the whole adventure of life.
Yes. And
I'll put them in the chat after we've finished the live.
And
I'll put the links.
Thank you. And then Letty Gooch says, so much loss. And so, everybody, we're going to take just a minute break because we want to make sure that we can share this on Instagram. And Instagram is, Instagram. And when it gets to the hour mark, it's difficult to share around. And these conversations are so very vital that Laura and I want to make sure that we share it. So we're going to call this part 2, and we're going to close and then start it again in another minute. So give us a chance to reconnect, and you can come back and join us, or you can watch the replay. I want to ask Laura, where can people find you and your books online?
Certainly. So the website is www.dipism.com. That's D for Delta. DIPISM. D is for death, I is for in, and P is for practice. Death in practice, and ism is a way of life. If you just go to the shop, you'll see that both books are there, and you can purchase quite freely. Otherwise, you can contact me through that site as well.
All right, and they can follow you on Instagram at?
Yes, DIPISM. So it's D.I.P.ism. That's where you'll find me, Dipism.
Awesome. And then I want to let people know that if you want to go deeper in your journey and you're finding that you're experiencing or struggling with stress, loss, grief, and anything that you're struggling with that is stopping you from loving and caring for yourself, I want to invite you to the Thriving Mindfully Academies Self-Love Challenge, 5 Ways to Thrive in Springtime, that begins March 21st and ends March 25th. We start the day after spring. And spring is a time where we are called to plant new seeds, new beginnings, make fresh starts. And why not make a fresh start in how you are loving and caring for yourself? If it's grief that you're dealing with, know that grief and loss and any struggle that you have is a red flag for you to deepen your self-love and self-care practices. When you have the self-love and the self-care in place and it's actively happening on a daily basis, you're in a better position to navigate your life, your relationships, and your career no matter what's happening. It's a preventative measure. It's like your insurance plan. It's your safety blanket. So click the link in my bio to learn more about the challenge. Join it. If you know somebody who would benefit from it, have them join too. So I want to thank Laura for joining us for part 2. We'll start part 3 in a minute. Come on back and listen to us. If you're watching a replay video, just jump on over to my site on Instagram and watch. We look forward to seeing you in part 3. And as I always like to say, may we continue to embrace thriving mindfully in everything that we think, feel, say, and do. Namaste. See you in a few minutes. Bye.